You're at the Ember.js NYC meetup, October 2013 edition. If you're in the wrong place, now's the time. We'll give you a minute. Seriously, thank you everybody for coming out. It's awesome we got a great turnout tonight in a fantastic new space. We're really excited and grateful as always to Pivotal Labs for hosting us and now in this beautiful space with double the screen real estate or professional podium. So we're really moving in the right direction. I kind of miss the couches in the front. We'll see what we can do. So we have an awesome lineup tonight. We are going to have a bunch of talks. We have 4 lightning talks and 2 kind of main talks. It's going to be a busy night. We're going to pack a lot of content in. Hopefully, by the time you leave, your brain will hurt a little bit. And I have a couple of announcements before we go, and I'm also going to turn it over to you guys for any announcements that you've got. So think about that for a minute. We just opened up RSVPs for the next Ember.js Hacker Hours. It's going to be on November 5th. Excel, am I right? November 5th at Simple Reach. Thank you, Simple Reach, for hosting. And Ryan Toronto, is Ryan here? Yeah, no. Ryan Toronto is going to be leading a session at Hacker Hours around Ember.js testing. And for those of you who are not familiar with Hacker Hours, what we do is it's a much more limited RSVP kind of group than this larger group. We limit it to about 20 or 30 people, and we try to offer a lot of mentoring and helping people out who are either just getting started or trying to level up. Or have some member skills and want to give back to the community. So thank you to Excel, who's right over here in the gray sweatshirt, for organizing that and for changing up format and helping to experiment and make this the most valuable it can be to the community. So again, that's on meetup.com right now for RSVPs, just opened for that. The next night like tonight is going to be November 20th. That is not yet on Meetup, but by the time you leave here, it will be. And so we're looking forward to that as well. One other big announcement, Ember 1.1.1 is now out. It's got a bunch of bug fixes. Alex, what else am I missing? Or Thomas, anything exciting I should announce? All right, mostly bug fixes. One of the big pieces of under development that I know a lot of people are interested in is query params, and those are in Canary now. So if you're not familiar with the Ember release system, there's stable, beta, and Canary. It's very, very similar to the Chrome release system. And so Canary you can pull down and basically enable whatever features you want using feature flags. So if you're interested in using query params today, you can certainly get started with Canary, and they will work their way through beta and into stable. Yeah, Steph says, don't be afraid to use Canary. Yep, yeah, Canary should be solid. It's tested. And if you find a bug in Canary, the core team will be very appreciative, and the rest of the community will as well. Our first talk tonight the first main talk is going to be from Brian Cardarella, who came down from Boston to talk about ember-easyForm and ember-validations, which we are totally stoked about. But before I bring Brian up, we have an exciting event in the JavaScript world happened today. The launch of a tool that many of the Rubyists in the room have come to love called Code Climate that gives your code a kind of letter grade rating as far as its quality goes, is now just announced coming to JavaScript. And so I want to bring up one of the principals over at Code Climate, Noah Davis, to tell you a little bit about that.
Thanks. Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Good, sound-wise? Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I don't know. I guess I'm going to assume that not all of you know Code Climate. So just real quickly, Code Climate is about automated code reviews. So we have our robots look at your code and then try to take over the world or tell you about your code. So we analyze your code for complexity and look for potential bugs. And that's the basic idea. There are a lot of tools out there for complexity analysis that you can use on your own. And that's sort of where we started with the pains of trying to use these tools on our own. Those tools will tell you at a single point in time, like how are you doing? But the problem with those tools is that what you really want to know is over time, how are you doing? Are you improving? Are you getting worse? Especially as a team. So that's what Code Climate came out of. And as Luke said, it started as a Ruby tool to analyze Ruby. And we spent a long time getting it right for Ruby. And now we are proud to announce that it works with JavaScript. So we thought JavaScript was a good second language. A lot of people are using Ruby and JavaScript in mixed projects, and of course there's great client-side frameworks like Ember. So that's what we did. It's free for open source if you want to give it a shot. And I was just going to go through some quick hits here about how it works. So this is like your basic feed. And this is what I was saying about changes over time. These are files that are getting better or worse over time. And then if you click through each of these, you'll get a sense of why did it change. And it will give you information about duplication, information about complexity. So here's a complex method. It will show you it in line. That's pretty complex. As well as linting warnings. So these are lint warnings. The linting is configured. If you guys use JS hint and you have .js hint RC files, it will pick those up and report on them. It shows you, your full source listings with the highlighted complex code. We also have trends graphs. So this is more, again, about seeing it over time. This isn't a great example because it's only 2 snapshots, but the idea is you would see a graph over time of your GPA, was how we roll out the quality of your code. And this is an interesting little graph. Basically on the far right are things that change a lot. And the higher up you go, the more complex it is. So basically if you're up in this corner, it means you are changing something a lot that sucks. So that's something you want to focus on. What else can I show you? Oh, Ember. So yeah, Ember is up on here. So we're free for open source, so Ember is up on here if you want to get a sense for how Ember itself does, and it does pretty well. And I thought I would also show you some of the other open source libraries out there that not as good, and some others not as. That's totally unfair. But I thought it was an easy one, so I did it. We are doing a promo tomorrow in JS Weekly. If you want to get a promo code, look for that. It's in there. That's all I got. Thanks for your time.
Awesome, great stuff. Why don't you go ahead and get set up? Thank you, Noah. Brian, you can put that in. So while Brian Carterell is getting set up, I want to open up the floor to announcements from you guys. Any events, people hiring, Ember developers, anybody have anything that they'd like to share? I have one announcement on behalf. Is anybody from Harvest here tonight? So Harvest is hiring an Ember developer. Harvest was the host of one of our recent events, a fireside chat that we did with the Ember core team. So they're friends of the Ember meetup. Happy to plug their job opening. They've got a pretty sweet office. Let's see what else is going on.
Was there a place?
I got nothing.
Probably right here, right? Sorry. It would suck if I ran out of power halfway through. Was it the wrong one?
Yes, it's that one, the black cable. Cool. So the gentleman who is getting set up behind me has been instrumental in bringing Ember.js to the Boston JavaScript community. Brian hosts the Ember meetup out of his offices and is the principal of a consultancy that specializes in Rails and Ember.js development in Boston called Dockyard. And so in addition to running that business, I'm not sure exactly where he finds the time, but he's also the author of 2 open source libraries that he's going to talk about tonight, ember-validations and ember-easyForm. And so with that, I'm happy to give the stage to Brian Cardarella.
Thank you. Oh. I blame my MacBook. I just placed an order for a new one, but this thing does it all the time. It'll just go dark on me and then eventually come to life. It's coming back. Okay, there we go. All right, so I'm going to talk today about 2 libraries that I've written, ember-validations, as Luke said, and ember-easyForm. They're both complementary to one another. Excuse me for my voice. I'm a little bit under the weather, so I'll be making some throat clearing noises, unfortunately. I'll try to fix it with this. All right, so I'm the principal of Dockyard. What's up? No, I know. Yeah, I know. I'll talk about that. All right, so I'll apologize up front for my Ember Camp talk if anybody saw it and was there, unfortunately. I gave a talk on an earlier version of these libraries, and I was up very late the night before, not drinking. I was actually preparing my slides. I got about an hour and a half of sleep, and then I got up in front of everyone at Ember Camp, the first Ember conference, and I used Reveal.js. I don't think I was using slides at the time, which is a hosted Reveal.js. But Reveal.js allows you to go like side to side and up and down. And I like to categorize like my verticals. So I'll do like ember-easyForm as a vertical, ember-validations as a vertical, and I forgot an entire vertical. I had 20 minutes, I finished in like 7 minutes. I was like, what the hell did I miss? I got off stage and it was very depressing. So hopefully I can redeem myself a little bit tonight. Anyway, Brian Cardarella, Dockyard, full stack, web and mobile consultancy. Mostly Rails. We're really pushing Ember pretty hard in Boston. We want to be known as the really friendly Ember shop in Boston. We have an amazing design team, an amazing engineering team. If anybody's looking to build out amazing products, please consider us. All right, Ember validations. The GitHub URL right at the top. And I'm going to start right with live coding. So let's take a look at a basic form. So you get, this is pretty easy stuff. So you have basic form, name, email, password confirmation. I'm sure people have actually gone and built out their own custom validations, or they use another validation library in Ember, or perhaps they even used my library. Just so we're on the same page, I will go ahead and implement some simple validations here. So we can see that I'm clicking through the fields here. I can submit it. It's just going to, oops, live validation already failed. All right, so let's just assume the submit button will actually show an alert message. It's not going to actually submit anything. It's just for the sake of validating that that button works. Now, inside inside this form, it's just being wrapped in a form controller, or rather, it's being called from a form controller, which is right here. And I'm just going to add in, sorry, I am going to, first of all, that's why I smashed it. All right, so Ember validations, I'm just going to mix in the Ember validations mix-in. Oh, yes, sorry. Tell me when it's good. Yes? Everyone good? Goodish? One more time? Okay. Ember validations mix-in. And I'm going to declare my rules as such. So I'll do name, true, email, and I don't remember the email regex, so I'm just going to do that. Oops. Password, confirmation, true. Okay, so I put these in here, and we still don't see anything. The reason is because there's two layers that's happening in the application. There's the view layer, which is completely separate from the model layer. Ember validations just happens on the model layer. So we need to tell the view layer about any errors if they exist. So let's go in, should I make that look better? So let's go in and add that. So here, all I'm going to do is add in a, on the object itself, there is an errors object that gets added in. And then the errors object is made up of keys that map back to the properties, and the values of those are always an array that comprised of all the error messages that occur for that given property. And we're just going to get the first message off of that property. So this one's named, that first object. This will be the most live coding I do too, so excuse the little bit of silence. All right. So when we notice we loaded the form, remember that the model layer is independent of the view layer here. And all we're doing is we're just showing the errors that exist on the model. Now, Ember validations will, by default, actually validate your model on initialization of the model. It will also validate your model on every single property set. So there's observers that are observing each of the properties. These are what are called live validations. So actually, is that not hooked up? Oh, shit. OK, so I'll move on to the next part. I'm not going to debug this part because the rest of it is working. But anyway, so what would happen is that I would go ahead and I would type in the name, and the validation would disappear because it's going to be, the error message is no longer going to be anything in the array. So we can imagine that it would be gone. In the case of the actual model object, there are two properties that are on it that are really important. There's an isValid flag, and the isValid flag is going to be a product of all of the validators' isValid flags. So when I declare my declare validation rules, these actually get instantiated into validators that are on a validators array. The errors object I've already gone over, which again is just comprised of all the error objects that are on each of the validators. The live coding failed. So the initial version that I had written of this that I showed back at EmberCamp was actually a reimplementation of what I call Rails-like validations. And those were validations that were blocking. So you would call a validate function upon your model, and it would iterate through all the rules and actually run the validations. At the end of the blocking call, it would then give you an errors array with all the messages on there. This was maybe a good first attempt. A lot of other people have implemented something very similar. After EmberCamp, I actually spoke with Stefan, and he made mention of a different approach that he had been taking with validations that I went ahead and have been attempting to implement over the past few months. So this comprised of a major rewrite of the existing Ember validations library. I'm going to call them Ember-like validations. So all the validations are promise-based now. When you run a validation, it's no longer blocking. The validation model, or rather what I'm calling it, the validation graph that exists on the model, is only complete when all the promises are complete. It supports all the common validations, which I can get into a little bit later. As I mentioned earlier, the validators are instances of classes. So what this means is we can actually pass in more than just validator rules into the validators array. The objects that are passed in there, as long as they respond to isValid and the errors, the errors object, they can be part of our validation graph. And we'll see how this lends itself towards far more complex graphs when we start introducing relationships. So, Ember-like validations. And what I mean by that is the validator instances, they actually are observing the properties for any changes that are live. The state of the graph itself can be added to at any point in time. So whether or not that happens on object instantiation, or for instance, if you have let's say you have a user and that user has many dogs, and you want to add more dogs to his dog pound or whatever. The validation state of each of those dog objects will now become part of the master's validation graph. Removal of one-to-many relationships works, but removal of one-to-one relationships is not working so well right now. Validations are promise-based. They should never, ever rely upon race conditions. The remote validations section of Ember validations is in limbo right now. I actually spoke with Luke on the way over here. One part that is, so because they're promise-based, they can be implemented any time. The difficulty, though, is that with the async validations, or rather with the async, like remote validations, you run into a problem of they're going to be kicked off every single property change. So you don't want to do uniqueness validation check on every single property change. You want to wait until all your local validators are complete, and then you would do your remote validations. Luke made mention that I could possibly make use of the Ember run loops debounce, and I'll take a look into that after this. Not tonight, probably sometime in the next week or so. And all promises must complete until your validation graph is actually considered to be complete. So all the common validations that come with it out of the box are, again, Rails-like validations. I come from a Rails background, so I just re-implemented these. So you have absence, acceptance, confirmation, exclusion format, inclusion, length, numericality, and presence. You can actually set custom validation messages on each of these validators. And there is a I18N-ish like library that's included in Ember validations. However, I would like to rip that out and make use of James Rosen's I18N Ember validation, Ember library eventually. And where the validators are instances of class, this is going to couple the observers for more complex validators like password confirmation. So imagine for a minute where if you see a validation property like this, and typically before actually creating instances of each of the validators, you would be iterating over this object and saying, okay, the property I'm going to be checking against is the password property, and I'm going to check confirmation true. And so your error messages would actually be attached to the password property. The usability of that is actually poor. So if you go ahead and you enter in your password, and then you go ahead and enter in password confirmation, and they don't match up, it's going to give you an error message on your password field. Instead, because now we're actually using instances and we have control over the properties that these instances work on, if we have a confirmation validator, we can just make the assumption that we're going to be actually working on the property of property name plus confirmation. And then on top of that, we're actually going to be observing both that property and the original password property. So when either of these properties change, we're going to be kicking off that validation. Oh, great, blank slide. Oh, no, not blank slide. So as I said earlier, the parents' isValid is a product of all the children's isValid states. The error messages are the sum of all the children's. This leads to possibly an infinite depth validation graph. So let's take a look at a very simple visualization of that. Let me just reload this. Okay, right here. So imagine that this is now going to be a visualization of your object graph. And at the parent root here, you have like a user. That user may have two friends, and those friends have other friends, and so on and so on. And you have a form that you need to ensure that all the validations for each of these objects are in sync in order to save the rootmost object. Now, each of these are green, so let's assume that all of the states of each of these objects is valid. And if we happen to make just one of the root nodes invalid, you can see that the isValid state, that would have been bad. You can see that the isValid state actually travels its way back up to the root node. And that's what happens in Ember validations, and how the actual root node itself isValid state becomes calling it a product, I don't know if that's the right term, but at least a product of all the isValid states of all of its children underneath it. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So Ember validations itself is not complete yet. It's 1.0 beta-ish. I do want to add uniqueness validator. I think that's a vital validation needs to get in there. There needs to be an easy path to adding additional remote validators. For instance, imagine if you're using Stripe and you have a credit card form that you're filling out, you want to bring this, the actual result of entering that credit card information into your validation model, and that'd be very important to have. Custom validators are also not in there right now. Prior to about a week ago, I was telling people if they want to do custom validators, then they would just declare their own custom validation class and call that as a normal rule. Someone made what I think is a really nice, open up an issue on GitHub and made this suggestion where we can add this validates prototype onto the function. And this will allow us to add in a function like custom validation rule directly into our validation rules. We can then, because we're calling on validates, we can wrap that in our validation-based class and bring it to our entire validation model properly without having to expect people to implement all of the boilerplate that's expected of the validation instances themselves. The way that I see this working is that the first property would be the property that the error messages would get attached to, and then any additional properties would be properties that would also observe. And last but not least for Ember validations is going to be Ember data support. This is kind of the most frequent question that I get on Ember validations, and the short answer for this is that it's coming eventually. The little bit more detailed answer is that there is a conflict between what Ember validations tries to do and what Ember data tries to do. Ember validations expects to have its error object available to it all the time. And if you mix in Ember validations into your models directly, the Ember data library, when a server-side request fails and you get back an error key in your return JSON, it will blow away the errors object on your model. And Ember validations then throws a fit. In the meantime, you can, and what I actually suggest people to do, regardless of using Ember data, is actually mix in your Ember validations into your controller rather than your models. That, I think, is a superior way to, and probably the right way to actually be running your validations. The reason for that is context matters within the Ember application. And when you mix in your validations into your models, you're now giving it a global state of the validations. So now regardless of what inputs you're going to have on your form, it's still going to give you it's still going to run through all the validations that you've declared on that model if it's now your entire validations are specific to that model. Whereas if you're working with the form, you're going to be working with the context of a controller. And if it's an object controller, you can just mix in the validations directly into the object controller and just have that delegate that through to the content. And that way, you're going to be able to not have to deal with conditional validations, which I think to be very messy because you have to maintain all these state flags and see which one, in this case, this validation applies. In that case, that validation doesn't apply. So I think it's much better to go the route of the controller. And that's pretty much it for Ember validations. Before I move on to ember-easyForm, are there any just quick questions on validations themselves? No? Okay, moving on. All right, so ember-easyForm. So let's go back to a working form this time. So in this case, with the basic form that blew up at me, what you would get is live validation. So the error message would be happening regardless of what how someone actually came into the form. So you saw that when I refreshed the page, the error message was showing immediately, and if it was working properly, you would have seen as soon as I provided a value that satisfied a validation, or rather satisfied a validator, that the error message would have gone away. Now, there's a lot of research done into form conversion because getting people to fill out forms and actually sign up for your application and be able to give you data and pay for things is a very important thing on the internet. So some of the research that's been done, if you were to look online, it's out there. Luke Roblowski is one of the guys that has an article written on this. And of the different ways to display error messages, the one that leads to the highest conversion rate is not live validations. Because what ends up happening is you see the validation message, and as soon as you start typing it, either it's yelling at you immediately that what you're typing is wrong before you've even had the chance to fully satisfy it the first time, or, which is even worse, is that when you start typing it, your eye drifts over to the right-hand side or left-hand side, wherever the error message is. And this little bit of eye movement actually leads to lower conversion rates. So instead, the workflow that he suggests is that when you start typing the first time, while you're typing, there is no error message that's supplied if the form fails, rather if the input fails. Once you focus out of it, if the value is invalid, then you display the error message. And when you go back into it, as soon as you satisfy that error message and you come back out of it, the input goes back into its original state. So the next time you go back into it, if you put in a wrong input again, it won't show that error message until you come back out. So ember-easyForm allows us to integrate with ember-validations. But in addition to that, it's also going to allow us to create semantically, semantically true or a better semantic markup for our forms in a more concise manner than writing them yourselves. So I'll show you the ember-validations kind of mixing it first. And we can see right here that the submit button is already disabled. The ember-validations ember-easyForm will actually take the isValid state of the model and will set the submit button to disable state depending upon that. And then once the model is valid, disabled, it'll re-enable the button. So I will satisfy each of these. And you can see that when I come off of it and I go back onto it, now it is giving the error message at the proper time. Example.com, password. And now I can click submit, and I must have an action that's not going through properly. But regardless, the submit button came alive again. What you noticed too was that now it is valid under this state because I don't have a presence validator on my password property. I just have the confirmation validator. So we can go ahead and add that pretty easily. So now if I just reload this, I can do Brian, test it. Now it's waiting for me to actually provide. So whereas previously, when this is empty, the button was still disabled. And if I were to come off it, it says can't be blank. But if I provide a password, I can now actually submit the form. We can add some additional validations. Let's say we wanted to have a length of our password. So it's only 3 now. Oh, that ran over. It's too short. Minimum is 5 characters. We can go up and we can provide custom messages for each of the validators. So in the case of name, it now needs your name. This was some of the stuff I was going to show on the basic form, but the basic form wasn't working, so I figured I'd show it to you here. So I'll show you the content in a second, but the helper that ember-easyForm adds in is identical to the helper, or rather the component that exists within Ember right now, the input one. And ember-easyForm does overwrite it. I would be very interested in having a way where within the context of ember-easyForm's block, that you would be using ember-easyForm's input helper, and outside that block, you would be using Ember's helper. But in the meantime, the solution is just to override it. So we can quickly create semantic forms. And the submit button, when you add it in, it will assume that there is a submit action either on your route or your controller that it's going to delegate to actually move forward. There is wrapper support as well. So right now, Bootstrap is included within ember-easyForm, but I'm going to be taking that out because I don't want that in there. I'm hoping that someone is going to take that when I take out and put it into an external plugin. And it integrates with ember-validations. It will properly set the input type based upon the property name. So imagine that you have a password property called password. it will actually set the input type to password instead of text. Input types can be overridden, so it will default everything to text input type. You can change it to a text area. You can change it to a checkbox if you'd like. No radio button support, but that's not my fault. OK, so here is the syntax for adding inputs. And actually, you know what? I don't have a slide for actually showing the form block itself, so let's just take a look at that. So to get the entire form, this is essentially what it is. You just pass it form-4, and you're going to pass the context in which ember-easyForm is going to be working. In this case, I'm passing it in the controller, and then I just name each of the individual inputs. I'm giving name, email, password, password confirmation. So when you actually pass in an input, and you pass the property name that you want to work with, you're going to get this, this markup that gets spit out. So it will properly actually set up the labels for attribute to link up to the input ID, and it will give you an error span as well if ember-validations is present. Or rather, I think if there is an errors object present on the model. You can add in hints. So if you give it a hint attribute on the input, it will add in a hint span with your little hint down there. You can change the type, as I said, so you can change the text. It'll switch it over to the text area. And these are the types that it comes with, so pretty much everything. String is the default. You can do checkbox, select password, email, URL, telephone, color, search, number, and date. It will take the property name of the password. So as I mentioned earlier, it will do password type if it's a password. And these are the ones in how it works. So it will do a regex for just password, email, URL. That's supposed to be a start of regex on color. Telephone, it will check to see if the property name begins with tel in order to do telephone, and then search. And it will set the property types for those appropriately. And then it will also work upon the value of the property to set the property type. So in this case, I'm setting birthday, which does not match to date, but it will be set to a date value, which is my birthday there. And then I'm giving an input of birthday, and then it will properly give me a date input type when it prints out. This works pretty well with Ember Data's types. Yes, so you can do as equals, and you give it the type. And these are the ones that derives the input type from the values. So strings are default. If it's a number, and again, floats, integers, dates, and booleans will map to checkboxes. There's also a block form to the input. So if you're familiar with, if people have done Rails in here, you're probably looking at this and say, oh, this looks exactly like simple form. That's because I ripped off simple form. One of the nice things about simple form is that it gave you pretty much what I have here, but it'll allow you to actually override the content of the div container for each of the inputs. So if we were to go, like for instance, this one here, there is a default order of the elements within the input div. And in this case, it's always going to be label, input, error, and then if you provide a hint, hint will always be last. But there may be reasons why you want to reorder that. So if you give it the input block form, you can then explicitly call each of the individual line item helpers. And I should probably have reversed that just to make it more clear. But label field, input field, and you would give it the property name that's going to be working against, and it will output the HTML in the order in which you provide. And these are the helpers that you get out of the box with ember-easyForm. So input field, label field, error field, hint field. OK, so let's tie it all together. Whereas previously I mentioned the idea of the validation graph and how you can create a infinite depth, but I don't suggest you try that, but at least a depth more than one on what you're validating against. So I have an advanced form here, and here's my user info. So I'm going to make this form valid. So now it's valid. I can submit it. Hey, that one works. All right, so now I'm going to add a profile. And actually, the profile property on the controller, it just set it to a profile object. And the profile object Where is it? Okay. Nope. So profile object here is just has its own set of validations that are declared independent of the user object. And I just set the title and expects it to be present and expects the values to be either owner, CEO, or boss. So if I set this to owner, now the entire validation graph is valid, and I can submit my form. But if I set this to an invalid value, now it is no longer valid. And we can do the same thing with so that's a one-to-one relationship. So we can do the same thing with one-to-many relationships. So I'm going to add a dog, and I call this my dog, Boomer. She's a golden doodle. And now it is true. But let's say I want to add another dog. And now you can see after I keep adding more and more models, as long as one of the nodes in the validation graph is invalid, the rootmost node's properties will be, or rather the validity of the rootmost node will be false. So I will make this one true. I think I required golden doodles for all of them, so I'll just make that. But then we can go ahead and actually remove a dog. So if I were to add a dog that was invalid, we can see that I should probably put like an is valid text on there, but we'll just go off of the disable state of the button. And once I remove the dog, I removed the wrong dog. I think I'm shifting, that's why. Okay. Let me do this. I'll do it here. Okay, so it's invalid, and when I remove the dog, it removed it from the array, and now the entire validation graph is valid again. All right, so that's pretty much it for Ember Validations, ember-easyForm. I love pull requests. I've been working on this for a couple months now. I have some people that are interested in it. They're helping out, but I love more help. I love more use cases for how people want to do their own validations, or if anyone has any interesting ideas, because I think this, especially with the power of creating these really deep validation graphs, we can do something that is unique for Ember that a lot of the other client-side libraries don't have. So if you're interested in contributing, helping out, checking it out, there are the GitHub libraries, and thank you very much for having me in New York City.
All right, thanks, Brian. We've got time for a couple of questions. Alex?
I'm just wondering, did you override the input helper to just check if it's inside of form 4, and then if not, do the normal default behavior?
I was going to do that. There was talk of checking if it was within like a specific container, but I really haven't spent a lot of time looking into how to solve that yet. But I want it to be solved because it shouldn't be like overriding the Ember form 4. But I did not want to use a different syntax because it was very concise. I want to keep easyForm concise as well.
Cool.
I had one idea for you. It would be cool if, I love the declarative validation syntax. It would be cool if to do a custom validation, if it would look in the container for that name. So it could look at like validations :
I see. So looking outside of the model itself or the controller for.
Yeah, like when you do the declaration. So if I say like foo : true for some new kind of validation, you could look in the container for validations : foo and just discover it that way.
That's cool. I'll consider that.
Cool. All right, thanks again, Brian. Appreciate it. What's that? Okay.
Oh, you got the old stuff.
I do. I ordered a new one. Oh, you don't need. You're only 10 minutes. You're fine. Yeah, I'll be quick. All right, let's take a quick stretch break while Jonathan gets set up. If you need another drink, do that. And also, while you're stretching, find somebody in this group who you haven't met before and introduce yourself. You probably have something in common. All right, you good? All right, let's find a seat. We're going to get rolling. We have entered the lightning talk portion of the evening, which means we're going to have 3 talks in rapid succession. We've got Jonathan Goldman, Thomas Boyd, and Alex Machnier lined up for you. And the first talk by Jonathan Goldman, one of the first speakers to have back-to-back appearances in the Ember.js meetup series, was last appeared in the September meetup attaching electrodes to Stefan Penner's head. is now here to tell us about reduced computed. Jonathan Goldman.
Okay, hello. Thank you, audience. So this talk is kind of a two-parter, because the first part is describing how you can reduce your usage of computed properties, and the second half is how to use reduced computed. So there's kind of two bits. The subtitle is Functional Big Data Transclusion in the Browser. So take that with you. What is the best feature of Ember? Is it the routing? Maybe. Is it Ember Select? Definitely not. It's computed properties, I think. I think they're magic. And they make using Ember sort of the joy that it is. So I have some JS fiddles that I would like to show you. So the first one is if you are in an environment where you are not yet using easyForm or ember-validations, you might do something. How do I make this bigger? Can anyone see that, or is that too small? So what we have here is we have an index controller. We have 3 inputs. And I have an email valid computed property and 2 others. And I disable the button if they aren't all true. So if I type in foo bar, the sign up button lights up. If you're using easyForm, then you don't have to go through all this rigmarole. And that's great. So that's kind of the poster child for computed properties and why they're great and having data binding and all that great stuff. However, I don't know if you guys know this. I discovered this the other day. You can actually reduce a lot of that boilerplate by using the Ember computed stuff. So here I have exactly the same inputs, just a slightly smaller controller. So I have an email valid computed property, which is true when the path is not empty. Same for password valid, a confirmation email. Unfortunately, there's nothing in the Ember computed namespace that allows you to say these 2 properties are equal yet. Hopefully that will arrive one day. And then a button enabled, which does an Ember computed AND, which ANDs all of the paths together, and then a button disabled, which does the inverse of button enabled, because you can't bind the enabled attribute in like an inverse way, unfortunately. So I thought this was really cool. I discovered this, and I was like, wow, I have to go and rewrite everything again from scratch, which I did. That was a fun half an hour. So I've now reduced, this is computed properties just reduced. This is kind of the first half. I thought that was great. And I discovered this because I was spelunking around in the Ember documentation in the API docs. And I think one of the common complaints about Ember is that it has bad documentation, which is just, I think, a bold-faced lie. Those 2 tabs, guides and API, like on that front page of the API, just go there. There's so much good stuff there that I didn't even know about. And if you just go take a look, you'll find some interesting stuff. So this is how I discovered the reduced computed bits. They're actually right at the bottom. Don't know if you can see that. So what is a reduced computed? A reduced computed it's a computed property which observes the state of an array and then reduces it down into a single value. So that's like a lot of words. But I don't know who here is familiar with the concept of MapReduce, like how Google apparently does their searches. But it's the reduce part of that MapReduce. So taking a result and bringing it down into a single value. So 2 examples of that would be Ember computed min and Ember computed max. So min would give you given an array of integers, it would give you the smallest thing in that array, and max would give you the largest. And I wanted just to show you how easy it is to implement these. So this is the source code for Ember computed max, taken straight from the reduced computed macros file. So I'm going to attempt to walk you through this based on my limited understanding of. I can zoom in. Ta-da. Check that out. So there's kind of 4 parts to a reduced computed. There's the initial value. So in what state does the computed property start in? So in this case, we're starting with negative infinity. And then there's 2 functions you have to implement. There's added item and removed item. Added item is called when, as you would imagine, an item is added to the underlying array that you're observing. And removed item is called when an item is removed. And both of them have the same signature. Accumulated value is the value that's passed along through each iteration of the reduced. So if you are, and I will show this later, if you have a computed property that sums an array, the accumulated value would be the thing that you would always be adding to. And I'll show you that in a minute. Item is the item that has been added or removed. Changed meta is some metadata about the item change, such as the index or the property that changed, or what have you. And instance meta is kind of like a scratch pad for the instance of the computed property that you've created. So that is also super useful. So here what we're doing is, or what the gentleman who implemented this is doing, is when an item is added, he's comparing the accumulated value, which is the current maximum value, to the item that is passed in and returning the highest one of those. And in the case of removed item, he's seeing if it's lower, and if it is lower, he's returning the accumulated value, or he's returning null, which in this case will actually recompute the reduced computed, which is kind of a one-off case for min and max, but there's other ways to do that, so I'll show that in a second. There's also an options hash, which is used for setup. So when you initialize, and this may be completely false, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but the options is kind of like the place where you would initialize the computed property. I think there's an initialized place for initialization. So the secret source of this is this change meta and this instance meta. So the change meta, like I said, is index item, which array actually changed, because you can observe multiple arrays with reduced computed. You can have 2 arrays, and you want the intersection of those 2. You would have 2 arrays changing, the property that changed. And the instance meta, like I said, is a scratch pad where you can store the reduced computed state. So another example. So here we go. What I have here is, this is the busted version. Forgive me, I need to fix this. This is what happens when you use somebody else's computer. Hold on. Whoop. Whoop. Great. So what I'm doing here is we have some subjects and a GPA of some description. And then we're taking the average of those, computing that at the top, and then the total as well. So I've changed this to 2, and this to 5, and this to 6. And you might look at this and think, that's pretty straightforward, right? But what's important to understand is this is reacting to the array's elements changing. So you're only updating the part of the computation which has been affected. So if you had quite a complicated algorithm here, you would only change, you would only have to recalculate the part that changed, which is quite a big performance improvement. So the way that looks is I've got an index route where I'm populating a model, and then here's the example of the sum. So I'm adding the item to the accumulated value. When I remove an item, I remove it from the accumulated value. So if I add something here like, I don't know, French, I'm not very good at French. So, oh yeah, this is the broken version. So if I hadn't refreshed the page like an idiot, go forward, no. Then you would have seen the average and the total update. And then the average is slightly more complicated. So I'm storing the initial value is 0. And in the instance meta, in the initialize function, I'm initializing the total and the count to 0. And then in added and removed item, I'm updating that. So when I add an item, I don't recompute the entire average. I just add the item to the total, divide it by the count, and then I've got the average. So I thought that was pretty fancy. So that's reduced computed. And it has a sort of an older brother, I suppose you could call it, which is array computed. And it's exactly the same as reduced computed, except the result of the computed is an array, not a value. and the result is kept up to date. So if you pull out an array computed from your object and then change it, the reference you've taken out will be kept up to date. So if you've ever needed to sort, a collection or filter it, then this is something that you're probably going to end up using sooner rather than later. So I'm going to show you an example of this. And this is actually the use case that I needed and how I discovered reduce computed. So hopefully this loads. Right. So if you use Bootstrap, there's this really great control, this list group. And I wanted to be able to group things by key and then show a group count, right? Nightmare scenario. So I'm going to just demo this. So I'm going to add someone to this. Now I'm going to add my sister. We'll just say for argument's sake that she is 35. When I add her to this list, that just incremented the number to the right. So I'll show you that again. Add my brother in. Boom. So what we're doing is we're doing like a group by with a count. And I implemented that probably wrong, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm pulling out the key. I'm finding an existing group for that key. If it doesn't exist, I create it. If not, I increment the value, the number value. And when you remove an item, I essentially do the inverse. I decrement that property when an item with that key is removed. There is some complication here, which I will show you. Notice I made you all 22 years old for this case. I wasn't sure how old you were. So there's a few things here that are really cool that I wanted to show. So these computed properties are chainable. So this is actually not quite as simple as it looks, because what I'm doing here is I'm saying only show people in this list if they're over 21. So if I add my niece, for example, she's 4, I'm not going to increment that count, because what I'm doing is I'm saying the people who can party, who are over 21, I'm filtering the model by that property can party hard, where it's true, and then I'm grouping by each of those. And there's a few things here that are pretty awesome. So you may not have seen this before. So partable.each, we know that. But then this wrapping it in brackets, that's actually a property expansion. So what that's going to do is it's going to create observers for both of those properties, but you only have to declare it once. And one other thing that I wanted to point out as well is that when you are looking at using this, you can't always rely on the state of the object that you're adding or removing. Because say, for example, I change a last name here on the underlying object, that I want to update the counts. So I need to keep track here of the previous value. This is how I'm doing it. This is the part that's likely wrong. I'm keeping the previous value for that item, and I'm using a GUID for that. So there's the Ember GUID 4 stuff, which is also new, to keep track of those so that I don't get into an inconsistent state. So this is, I think, super useful. It means that you can... Have you not been able to see the counts the entire time? Oh, can you? OK. Well, just for the people in the cheap seats. There you go. Look at that. Anyway. OK, so that's that. So moving on, what's next? There's two GitHub projects. There's Ember enumerology and Ember CPM. So Ember enumerology is a bunch of these computed properties that you can take advantage of. CPM is a computed property library, which has some common computed properties in it. It is actively being worked on. There's a lot of new stuff. There's some pull requests out there for this. I don't know when it's going to land, 1.2, maybe, fingers crossed. Somebody please rewrite Ember Select. I will give you $100. Plugs. There's a charity called codenow.org. They teach kids Ruby who can't afford computers, and then they give them computers at the end of it. I volunteer there. It's a really, really, really good cause. It's hard work, but very rewarding. Because I know a lot of people who do Ruby. Please sign up. They need all the volunteers they can get. I am hiring an Ember developer, so if anybody wants to do Ember and work for a hedge fund, which is probably, hopefully all of you, come find me. And I think that's the end. That's the end of Reduced Computed.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Well, Thomas is getting set up. If anybody's got a question for Jonathan, he can take it on this mic and give that mic to Thomas. Any questions about Reduced Computed? Alex Machineer.
I just want to make sure, actually. So I think the expansion shorthand stuff, I think that's a thing on beta, right? That's not released yet? Okay, yeah, that was just released, or at least put on beta, I think, just like 3 days ago. So if you're wondering why your code, if you're going to go through and follow that example, it's not working, just make sure you're using beta or canary. So. Yeah, the add each with the like curly brace and all like the specific properties that were being listened to. And at this, which I don't know enough about to comment on. All right.
Awesome. All right, Jonathan, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Our next speaker is a member of the Ember, relatively newly formed Ember release team, and he is going to talk to us about one of my favorite aspects of Ember, the Ember Resolver, and a project that spun off out of some work that my team and I did called Ember App Kit. So with that, Thomas Boyd.
Hi. So Ember App Kit is boilerplate for ambitious web applications, which is what Ember is all about. So by boilerplate, I mean ambitious web applications have lots of assets. I mean, everyone has JavaScript. A lot of us use CSS. Some of us are using all kinds of weird preprocessors. All of us are using handlebars, except some of us are using Emblem. And we're all using HTML, and a handful of people are using CoffeeScript. All these different assets that every time you start a new project, you have to go in and configure your build process to build out. Maybe use something like less.app, which can automate some of this, but not necessarily in a universal way. And all these assets have these different tasks we have to do. Compilation, concatenation, minification, linting, serving them, and then watching them for changes. All of this can be done with Grunt, which is a Node.js-based build tool. It uses a pretty simple declarative syntax for configuring it. And so Ember App Kit builds on kind of Grunt as a starting point to create this boilerplate that you can start your Ember applications with. Ambitious web applications have structure. I think we've all had projects that were just a complete mess of JavaScript just floating around and like not having a clear like mental mindset of where to put things, basically. So Ember App Kit gives you a structure for your assets, whether JavaScript or your style sheets or images. It has pre-configured tasks that will use that structure. For example, it comes with a less task. Regardless of whether you're actually using less or not, if it finds less files in your styles folder, it will immediately know how to compile them. It also comes with compass and stylus and a billion other things, all of which are optional. And so it comes with a pre-configured Grunt file, as well as a folder full of Grunt configuration. It comes with pre-built kind of testing scaffolding, I guess you'd say. And it comes with sort of examples on how to make tests. And it also comes with a Bower file, which Bower is a package manager you can use to install front-end dependencies, including Ember, Ember data, jQuery, handlebars, anything you need. But ambitious web applications have modules, which is something that isn't, with Ember, it's not always obvious on how to use any kind of module system with it. Because usually you just see this sort of thing, where you have can everyone see that okay? Yeah. You have everything just stuffed onto a global namespace called app, and there's no real clear way on how to sort of, instead of having this weird global namespace, use modules that are not adding things to a global, that are able to easily like resolve dependencies and that sort of thing. But so when we all start with Ember, we have some kind of application like this, where it's just you have all your script tags for your different dependencies, and then you have script tags for your templates, and then you'll include your app.js, which includes all stuff in the global namespace. That's fine when you're getting started. All the kind of documentation on the Ember website uses this sort of thing. The problem is it doesn't scale particularly well. This is from the to-do MVC example, which is only 7 lines of JavaScript includes, which is not that bad. But you can easily imagine, there's projects out there with like 200 controllers or whatever. You don't want to do this for every single file. And also you have issues of, you're putting everything on this global namespace, which makes it not really portable. If you have a controller you want to reuse somewhere, you can't just pull it out into another project. And so it's hard to test and it's hard to reuse, which is kind of why Angular developers make fun of us. So sort of solving this, we need a module system. So Ember AppKit uses ES6 modules, which are in the next version of JavaScript. The reason we do this is because they're future-proof. And Ember is kind of all about being future-proof. One of the nice things about having a lead developer who is on the committee making the next version of JavaScript. And so ES6 modules they're not super complicated, but there's a bit more to it than I can get into today on just how all the syntax works. The 2 key things you need to know are just there's an export default, which basically just says this next object is going to be the default export of this module. So then when I go to import it in another file, do import foo from a module called foo, it just loads that default export and calls it foo. And then you can just use it. The ES6 module transpiler is how we use this syntax today. So the module transpiler is a node-based tool. It was originally created in Ruby by Yehuda Katz and then ported to Node by Brian Donovan from Square. It's already used in several Ember-related projects, including Handlebars, RSVP, and the Ember debugging extension for Chrome. And it can take this ES6 syntax and turn it into AMD modules, which are used in require.js, or common JS modules. If you want to have a library or something, you can also use it in Node. The output is really easy to read and debug because it's just taking things from one module syntax, turning them into another. It's not going to rewrite the inner workings of your module or anything. It's just, if you can read AMD syntax, then you're good to go, and if not, it's not super difficult. But so now we have modules. The problem is we don't want to manually wire them all up ourselves. I don't want to ever have to write import. If anyone has a Rails background, you're probably used to just magical naming convention stuff just getting loaded. And so since Ember is built already on conventions based on the naming of objects on the global namespace, it has a thing called a resolver that does this. We can basically customize this resolver to, instead of looking stuff up on the global namespace, instead of looking for a post controller for a post route and then a post view and a post, well, it looks for post template either way. It can use load from the module system instead of trying to load off this global namespace. So if you remember the file structure I quickly showed off, we have a folder for controllers and a folder for models and a folder for routes. And each file within one of those folders is a module that will do a default export of a route, a view, a controller, or a model. These files are then resolved through the resolver. Again, if it has a post route and you need to look for the controller for that route, it will look for app/controller/post. And again, if you export defaulted the controller within there, it will automatically load it. I do want to give a brief disclaimer about syntax before I show this off. The ES6 module transpiler is in a kind of transitional state because ES6, the spec that defines these modules, as well as all sorts of new stuff in JavaScript, is undergoing a lot of churn. So what I'm going to show off here is based on the very recently released version of the transpiler. which is not what's currently used if you just clone the master branch of Ember AppKit. It will be in there soon. It's waiting on JS hint support for the new syntax. So let's mess with my resolution, so hold on. All right, can everyone see that okay? Oh, is it getting cut off? Or? Oh, jeez. All right, well, if you can at least see it over there. Okay, so I just wanted to show real quick how you would write a module in this so you could see it in action. So in the background here, I've got there's a grunt server task that you run that will create a development server as well as automatically watch and rebuild your assets when they are changed. So right now, we have this very basic application. Oops. All it does is it just shows, welcome to Ember.js, and then a list of colors. Very basic. This file here is app/route/index. So this is what populates that with data, which is then shown in a template. So let's say that instead of just having this array of colors, we want to have an actual model for a color. So since this is actually, Ember AppKit comes with Ember data, so you can actually just return get store dot find color. And what this line will do is it will go to Ember data and say, hey, look up the color model. Now Ember data, I haven't explicitly registered a color model anywhere, and I won't have to. All I have to do is make a color.js file in my models folder, then make a color model, which just has one property, which is just a string that is what color it is. And then give it some fixtures. So it'll be so we'll just stick with one. It just is red. And then I can export default color. Now, what this means is this file is a module, and that this export default color says take this model and export it as the main export of the module. And now, if I go in and refresh here, it will break. That is because Grunt occasionally will have a bug where it does not pick up on new files. So now, since I restarted it, there we go. Oh, except it shows the model instance instead of the actual color, because I need to change the template. Just change that. And then you notice here it says how long it takes to rebuild. And then ta-da. So that's kind of it for the demo, but I have a few more slides. So there's pretty much almost everything in Ember is resolver friendly now, which is thanks to awesome work being done by Steph, who's way in the back. Routes, models, which can be looked up through either Ember data's find or for this.model for in a route. Controllers, which can be looked up by this.controller for. The needs property on a controller, or the render tag in a template. Views can be looked up on the view tag in a template. As of Ember 1.2.0 beta, which is out like sometime in the past couple days, it came out, blog post about it today. Components and helpers are now resolver friendly, which is awesome. And Ember data's adapters, serializers, and transforms are all resolver friendly. Few last notes. I don't really have time for it, but testing is much easier with this, especially with both just with modules in general and with Ember AppKit's sort of testing scaffolding that it comes with. It's much easier to get started writing like unit and acceptance tests, and it comes with examples of each. Modules sort of have source maps. The problem is the actual transpiler doesn't have source maps, but when they are, so what happens is the modules get built to AMD and they concatenate together. It's at the concatenation step that source maps are made. So when you go to debug it, it will at least show you individual module files instead of a single like 10,000 line app.js. JS Hint is being updated to support this new module syntax. Right now it will just give you errors because it just doesn't know how to deal with this weird new ES6 stuff. Ember App Kit, so one of the downsides is that it generally has slower builds than Rake Pipeline, if anyone here has been using it. And that's just because Grunt doesn't really have a way to do partial or incremental builds. But work is being done in that direction. It remains to be seen what form that will take, but there are people working on it. And in general, all this work continues. There's a lot of docs to be written for Ember App Kit. There's a lot of just quality of life stuff we're still finding and fixing. And yeah, so I think that is it.
Awesome. Alex, you want to get set up? Cool. So we've got time for one question or two questions. Jonathan.
Hello. We're using Yeoman currently, which is kind of good and also bad. So how would you reconcile the differences between Ember App Kit and something like Yeoman? Like, why would I choose one over the other? Or why would I convert my Yeoman project to something like Ember App Kit?
Let me so Yeoman's Ember generator is really good. Ember App Kit's much more built out, I think, at this point. I haven't looked at Yeoman's generator in the past couple weeks, but last I checked, it didn't have quite as many pre-configured tasks. Ember App Kit's also on the path to becoming sort of the standard app kit, or at least that's the goal. So I do think that it's like a target that people try to kind of make their code work with. So I think it might be better for compatibility in the future. I think ES6 modules in particular are going to become more common. So.
There's no reason why Yeoman couldn't generate something like this and then benefit from the same conventions. Ember has a whole bunch of things, but the important part is the conventions that are made through the whole framework.
So the comment from the back for the people following along at home is that there's no reason that Yeoman can't generate something that conforms to these same conventions and uses the same sort of resolver approach to resolve them. Awesome. I want to say thank you to Thomas and say two things about Thomas. One is that he is one of the people that works really tirelessly behind the scenes to make the whole Ember machinery run, and we really appreciate it. And the second thing I want to say is that tonight was Thomas's first ever professional presentation software, so a big hand for Tom. Pretty good first time out, I would say. You have power working? Oh, it's this one.
It wasn't working. Or did for a second, I think. Come on. All right.
All right, good stuff. Next up, we've got one of the other hardest working men in Ember show business, Alex Machnier.
Oh, come on. This is real disappointing. I just mirrored the displays. Is there anything else I need to do here? Try one more time. Is this like not anyone else?
So we had one problem with Jonathan's machine too, and we switched to mine.
Well, that is quite annoying. It was just working like 20 seconds ago, was it not?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to try this. 10 seconds. I swear this is cool. All right, I'll at least just get started on what I plan on talking about. I don't have any slides. This is just some straight up code of some features that were added to 1.2 beta. So that's something that's available. You can download from the website. That's been up since, I guess, Monday or so. And it is the first post 1.0 release that is going to have some actual, yes. All right, should I even risk? No, I'm not going to risk mirroring this thing. So that is visible. And son of a piece of, what would it be? I don't understand. I'm going to keep on talking. We're going to do this TA style. Intro to Ember 101. So anyway, some new features are coming in 1.2. This is a cool one. I swear I'll be very frustrated if it does not work. Any ideas, anybody? Does anyone know if this can be plugged in like a less HDMI sort of way and then it'll just work? All right. Hello, once again. So I'm going to be talking about some new features on 1.2 beta, and this is some stuff that you can download from the website as of Monday. All right, so among the many features, and you can check this out on the GitHub repository for Ember.js, there's a features.md which talks about all sorts of new stuff which is now on beta, which you can check out. In another 6 weeks, I believe, it's going to be officially released, but this is kind of part of the new deal where we basically wait 6 weeks in between releases to make sure that all the features that we're trying out actually make sense and are working good before we put it on stable. So basically, the thing I'm talking about today is what is called error and loading substates, and this is useful. This is a very useful sort of new idiomatic Ember way of handling basically what to display when you are transitioning into routes that have to load lots of async data before actually displaying the template associated with that route. So I have what is a pretty decently idiomatic Ember app here, which just does a lot of kind of GitHub queries. I'll give you a little demo of what this actually does. And right now it's in a state where it's not really giving you a whole lot of feedback about what it's doing. It's kind of taking its time to load. I look up all the GitHub repos for my username, and everything just kind of happens slowly. I click repos, and there's not like a whole lot of feedback. And that's kind of something we'd like to change. So, I mean, the Ember router is already pretty powerful in that if I have this loading and I refresh the page, it takes a little while all the data comes in, but it actually works. Hooray. But this is kind of annoying because you don't actually know what is going on with your app while waiting for all this async stuff to come back. So let me just give a quick overview of what this app looks like. The templates are pretty straightforward, no need to look at that. I have in my kind of routes declaration, I have this GitHub nested route, which has repos, orgs, and nonsense, which is just a route I set up to kind of show you what happens when things go wrong. Nothing really happening here. This is basically responds to when you type in the username that you want to search and you press enter. And for every one of these little like kind of child GitHub routes, just performing some JSON request using this slow JSON function, which just does like a kind of jQuery get JSON, but it kind of introduces some extra stuff to make it slow enough so you can see some of the stuff that I'm talking about when promises take a really long time to resolve. So basically, the deal is this. There's not really anything more important to go on. As I mentioned before, how do you get some feedback when you are navigating into a route that takes a long time to load its data? That's not so much important there. Let me try it again. So whether it's refreshing the page or clicking between links, everything just seems kind of slow. And this is some of the work that I've been doing lately, and this, again, is now available on beta on 1.2 as of like 3 days ago. And what has been added is basically a really kind of easy idiomatic way to give some sort of user feedback about what's happening when you transition to a route. So for instance, I want to have a little loading screen pop up rendered directly into an outlet that makes sense given what route's actually loading. And I wanted to just say, okay, we're searching right now. That's we can't display anything on the new templates because right now we are still looking up data. And the way to do that is if it's a kind of top-level loading route and you want it to be kind of rendered right into the application templates outlet, then you're just going to name it loading. And we'll see in a little bit an example of kind of a nested loading state. But just by the fact that this exists and has the proper name that Ember is going to be looking for when it's checking to see if there's a kind of loading substate to enter, because we've named it this, now when we refresh the page, we get this thing that says searching. Your app renders right away. It doesn't have that weird 2-second gap while your like first-time route entry is taking a while to resolve its promises. We have this thing that says searching. So that's cool. But what is furthermore cool is that notice that the route that we're entering is github/myusername/orgs, GitHub organizations that I belong to. And right now, the only loading screen that we're seeing is this kind of top-level one that we defined that just says searching. So it turns out that both of the routes that I'm entering, from this parent GitHub route to the orgs route, return promises that are slow to resolve, which is why it takes so long to kind of get to that place. Basically, I've wired everything to take at least a second to resolve. And it turns out that if you provide, kind of according to existing standards for naming templates in nested routes, if you name this GitHub/loading, and you give this a different kind of, I mean, we can name it, provide the same template or whatever, but we're going to say, just to distinguish what we're looking at, that this nested loading state is going to say looking up info. So we would expect this, because we've named this properly, to say searching and then looking up info, as it kind of does this like waterfall transition into the route, which should look like this. Searching, looking up info, boom, all the data comes in. And let's see, did I have another example of this? Okay, there's one more concept to talk about, which is error substates, but is there anything that is confusing about what I just covered? Or is there any question as to why this is cool and why we would spend time to add this to the framework? Yeah?
At a use case, for example, if you have a navigation menu with the link to helper and
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So the question was, what are the use cases for navigation, right?
so the active class would only after the promises as resolved, but in UI you would expect an instant response after clicking a link. How would you deal with that?
How does that tie? So the question, I'm so just trying to understand.
The active class would only come after the promise is resolved, as I understand. But like in UI, you would expect an instant response to clicking something.
So you expect the URL to immediately update, or?
Like if you have like a full active.
The active state on the link itself.
Okay, so basically, I don't have these set up to be active, which shouldn't be too hard to add, right? Let me just check this real quick. And let me make this a little bit bigger, because I think it might be a little small. Okay, so what was I looking at? Active. Okay, let me just add a quick little thing of CSS here, and we can see how stuff looks. Hooray for live coding. Font weight bold. So, is this not working? All right, so I guess as it works now, and I don't know if you'd want to change this, but so there's some question. It might be in like a separate PR that we want to do, which is like, at what point do we want to actually update the URL for a route that you're trying to transition to? In some ways, it makes sense to immediately like change the URL when I click repos here, which does not presently happen. It changes once all the data comes in. And one reason for that is kind of error handling. So it's like if you try to transition into repos and then one of its promises rejects, is it good that you were displaying repos? I would guess probably yes, but that'll probably be in a future version of Ember. And I would guess that would also touch when a link became active. Because right now it's like lazy. It's going to wait till it actually fully enters that route before saying this is active. Though, given some of these primitives that have been added, it would not be too crazy difficult to make that work a different way.
It might be cool to have a loading class assigned there during loading.
Did I add that? I might have added that. Oh no, there's a different loading. If you try to use a model in a link to that is like currently null but may eventually be set, it's not my favorite feature in the world. I'd rather replace it with what you just said. But anyway, future Ember. Okay, so I want to move on to error substates, because this is supposed to be a lightning talk. Error substates work pretty much exactly the same way as what I just talked about, which is that Ember is going to be smart enough to say, okay, if there was an error trying to enter a route, kind of look up the route hierarchy and look for a properly named either route class or error template, and that is going to be what gets entered in the case of a rejecting promise or AJAX request that fails to work. So I'm going to add one at the top level. And this just says GitHub user lookup error. I mean, I'm only saying it's a GitHub user lookup error because the first parent route, this GitHub route, is going to be the thing that just looks up some basic information about the user. So whatever the GitHub API returns when I go to api.github.whatever/mechty. And so for instance, if I go to this nonsense route, because nonsense route tries to basically do this, as you can see here, this is some professional business. It looks up YOLO, which is, I think, version 4 of GitHub. It's not actually in version 3 yet, so it doesn't work. You get this, you've entered this loading state, which is the loading state at the top level, because I've only defined one at the top level. If I wanted to make one that was nested, then I would want to actually provide an error state, which is nested within the, as a child of this GitHub route. So I'll just make this more obvious. So you can see that when an error occurs, I'm just going to kind of start this over. This should work, but if I go to nonsense route, this is going to find the nearest, most leafy-ist, if you're thinking about this stuff as a tree, error state to enter. So when this errors out, we see that it's entered the nested loading state. And so this is, a lot of people have been sort of trying to do this kind of their own way, but it was never really, I think before this changed, it wasn't very simple to use the existing Ember primitives to get this done. But I can't imagine a way that this could be easier. Oh, I'll just say one more thing before moving on to the final presentation. That this is a very sort of like convention over configuration sort of way to go, but as we always strive to do with any of the Ember API, we like to build these patterns upon some lower level primitives that you can make use of. And in this case, it's no different. It's just the way that both the loading and error events work. Sorry, the way the loading and error substate stuff works is that it actually fires an event which you can catch. And you can override this event handler, this action handler, I guess is the word we're using now, to do something totally different than this kind of default, look for an error substate or look for an error route and try to enter that. So for instance, if I want to override the behavior of this nested whatever and basically catch something specific to when this nonsense route throws an error, then what I can do is, because all this substate magic is implemented as actions, or what used to be called events, I can say error, and just by overriding it and not calling super or not bubbling the error, I will basically get rid of that default error substate transitioning. So I can just say stuff broke. And when I try to go to nonsense routes, now I just get a little error that says stuff broke, doesn't enter a substate, which gives you lots of power to configure exactly what happens. Gives you a lot of control over error handling and loading substate stuff. So that's a cool thing to look forward to in 1.2, which in 6 weeks will be stable and released on the front page of ember.js.com, but definitely some cool stuff to put a little more control in your hands to handle some weird async errors and loading stuff. So enjoy.
Awesome. That is some sweet API, I have to say. Any people have questions for Alex? I know he opened up in the middle. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Oh, question.
You don't have to declare like a loading router, loading controller like you previously did, right? It's implicit.
I don't know if that was loud enough. You don't have to declare a loading route or loading controller as before. Before, for what it's worth, there was a very kind of not really functioning, broken loading route, which basically when we document the stuff, we'll show you sort of how to re-implement something like that, but it kind of required you to opt in by declaring a loading route. This sort of refurbishing or whatever of the loading substates does not require you to explicitly declare that route. But if you did declare a route and not a template, then you could, it would still enter that route. It's just it wouldn't do any of that default template rendering. Yes. Oh. Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, okay. I guess what I was thinking of is probably something already demonstrated. But yes, it works the same way for loading and error. So you can say GitHub error route, and that's going to be the sort of child of GitHub error state that gets all of its, activates and set of controller stuff called like any other route. Yes-ish. You can override it, but kind of behind the scenes, the way it's implemented is that like at every resource, there is an implicit sort of loading and error route that it knows about. Also on what? That's sort of a tricky thing. It's easier to sort of understand the API of like what to name the templates versus sort of how to think about like what children these loading and error states are. A route can't really have a child. So if you're trying to transition to a leaf route, which is GitHub/foo, and foo's the one that has an error, you can't enter a substate of foo because foo is a leaf route. It's basically going to start and look for a sibling error or loading state and go up from there. So when I said GitHub/loading as a template, that was going to be the thing that got entered or the error that state that got entered whenever one of those GitHub/repos or GitHub/orgs routes failed. The error would bubble up, yes.
Cool. Good stuff. Thank you, Alex. And for those of you who don't know, Alex Machnier is a member of the Ember core team, thanks to work like this. I want to take a little temperature of you guys. It's 8:52. There's one more talk on the agenda, but it's mine, so I feel totally fine about cutting it and doing it next month instead. So just by show of hands, who would like to stick around here for another half an hour and see more material? And who, okay, cool. And who would like to go to the bar or go home? Okay. Overall, you guys want more, so we'll go. I'll try to be as swift as possible. And oh, sorry. The talk is about actions and events in Ember. We're just going to roll right into it. If you need to get a drink or anything, just be quiet while we go, and I will not be insulted. All right. I'm going to go with the handheld. So events and actions in Ember. I am Luke. As soon as my leg heals, I'm going to be back to playing beach volleyball. I live here in Chelsea, around the corner. So here's the thing. Understanding at a relatively deep level events and actions in Ember is going to help you build more maintainable apps that work better and have fewer bugs. So let's dig in. What's an event? What's an action? We're going to start with some examples. So easiest example to understand about events is that Ember turns DOM events into actions on views. So if you want to handle a click on a view, you can implement a click method. This will get called when the user clicks on the view. Pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack more about how that works. Ember's lifecycle events work similarly also. Every time a view has been rendered into the DOM, the did insert element event is fired on the view, and you can handle it by implementing did insert element on your view. Many of you, if you've integrated a jQuery plugin, for example, into your Ember view, you've used this hook, I'm sure. An action might be initiated in this way by using the action helper in handlebars, where on this list item we've got a action helper, and say the name of the action here is select person. The context is this, a person in this case. When you click this, it's going to fire up an action by default up into the route, and where you can handle it inside of this actions object by defining a select person method. Again, these are examples. This is not the only way events or actions work, just to orient ourselves about what events and what actions are in Ember. So hopefully you've encountered these at least in passing or reading about Ember, if not in person. You could also handle, following the example, also handle the action in a controller in pretty much the same way. So general events benefits of both events and actions is that they are unidirectional. They're being fired typically up, starting from the view layer, up towards the controller and route layer. They don't need to be aware of their collaborators. So when you fire an event or you define an action handler, that code does not have to know who's going to handle that event. So this is very nice in terms of being decoupled. And decoupled code means that it's going to be easier to refactor and generally easier to change one side without having to worry about changing things on the other side. So these are things that we want. So one way to think about events is that they're like a town crier. The new mayor of Boston, Brian Cardarella, a town crier back in the day, might say. Little known fact about Brian, Brian was instrumental in reversing this crazy Massachusetts state tax law that was going to cause almost all software services to be taxed. And so Brian led a campaign in Massachusetts to get it turned around. It was going to be a disaster, and so kudos for you. So the town crier doesn't really care who's listening, right? He just wants to say out loud, you know, hear ye, this is what's going to happen. Contrast that with actions. When Captain Picard points to Riker and he says, make it so, he cares, right? Somebody better do something. Now, Riker doesn't have to do it himself. He can delegate, right? But somebody better make something happen. So another way of saying that is that events may be handled. Who cares? Actions in Ember really must be handled. Another difference between actions and events is that actions tend to be in the high-level language of the application. So just thinking about semantics. Whereas events are, so something like select person, file grievance. Whereas events tend to be more low-level, mouse over, click. The low-level language of a local component, whatever that component might be, whether it's a lifecycle event on a view like we looked at, or events that you're using in other parts of your app, they tend to be more developer language, whereas actions are hopefully more in the kind of your application business language. So what we're going to do is the remainder of the talk is diving into events in depth, diving into actions in depth, and then we will come up from there and we can chat about it at Lily's on 17th Street. So this is what we're going to go through. We're going to start with the event primitives in Ember, and we're going to build up. And one of the things that I love about working with Ember is that every time you peel off an API, there is another beautiful API underneath it. And you get closer and closer to Metal and pure JavaScript, obviously. But it's a really nice feature to be able a nice aspect to be able to pick the level that you want to work at. And I think that Alex's examples actually really demonstrated that philosophy in the way that he implemented loading states and error states. There's a high level, really conventional way to do things, and then if you want to drop down lower, you realize that you can, in his case, implement the loading action, implement the error action. So what we're going to do is we're going to start building up the way that events work in Ember from the ground up, and then we're going to eventually come back to the API that you're probably familiar with that we saw in the example. So the key things here are the Ember add listener and Ember send event actions, methods calls rather. And so what we've got is we've got a simple plain old JavaScript object defined here in line 1, and then we've got a function, log it, that's going to log something to the console. What up Boston? I gave this talk originally in Boston. We can then call ember.add-listener on the object and say, when the greeted event happens, run the logit function. And what's really cool about this is that there are no Ember objects to be seen here, right? There's nothing that extends from Ember object. So typically when you're building Ember apps, you're working with things in that object model. Part of the reason that I wanted to start here is because I wanted people to kind of understand that that's not a requirement for working with Ember, and particularly when you're interacting with you're integrating a third-party library that's not Ember native, it's useful to understand how that works. So when we do ember.send event and pass the object and the greeted as the name of the event, it's going to run this function and log what up Boston. If we send the event again, it's going to log what up Boston. Makes sense? Another useful primitive here then is obviously to be able to remove a listener. And so if we do the same setup, send greeted, get the log, and then we call remove listener and specify the event name and the function to remove, send the event again, nothing happens. Pretty cool. If you don't pass a function to this third argument, all listeners will be removed for that event. Can be useful as well. Don't do it by accident. And finally, in this level of the kind of API, if you pass true as a fourth argument to add listener, this is signifying that you want a one-time listener only. So as soon as you send greeted the first time, it's going to then remove itself. And then if you send greeted again to that object, nothing will be logged. So stepping up a level, the Ember evented mixin lets any object natively emit and or subscribe to events. So if we start with Ember object and we mix in ember.evented, which is cut off here, but you can see it on the other screen, and then we use a slightly higher level API than we were just looking at, we say something relatively elegant, person.onGreeted, log it, assume log it's the same function from the previous slide, it's just gonna log something. And then we say person.trigger and trigger the greeted event on that person. It's gonna log, what up Boston? And so this is nice, and so by bringing the same Ember evented on and trigger methods, as you might guess, call the same methods that we were just looking at, add listener, remove listener, and send event. Off is the equivalent of remove listener. So off greeted, log it, trigger, nothing will be logged. And .1 is the equivalent of passing that fourth argument of true that we looked at in a couple of slides ago. And so this is, again, much nicer than that longer method signature. And so the trade-off here, again, is that in the lower level API, we were working with pure JavaScript objects. This level of the API, we're working with Ember objects. We can provide a more expressive API, but it is perhaps less flexible in interacting with non-Ember APIs. So it's nice to kind of understand how these things are composed and what level you need to be working at. We can go one level up and be able to declaratively say for a method on an Ember object, based on a function prototype extension, say .onGreeted. So we have a property of this person object, log when greeted. It's a function that says NYC in the house. And then at the end of the function, we say .onGreeted. And so when we create that person, we trigger the greeted event on it. It's going to execute that function. So this is a really nice, expressive way to do. It's very similar to .property or .observes. Nice API. There's one event that is built into every Ember object, which you may have run into, which is .onInit. And when an object is initialized, it triggers, Ember triggers an init event on it. And so when we create a person event, it's going to trigger that init event. And since we say onInit, it's going to execute log when created and say, oh, there's a new person in the world. This gives another angle to lifecycle events. Ember.view mixes in ember.evented for you. So every view class has this behavior that we're looking at of .on and .trigger. And so instead of defining a event named didInsertElement, another way to do it is to have a function named expressively whatever you want to do, and then call .on and insert element on that function. This is really useful if you are implementing a mix-in that's designed to be mixed into other views, where you don't know if somebody may have implemented insert element themselves and is going to shadow your method name. So this is a nice solution to that. So the behavior of an event calling a method with the same name is something that Vue itself adds to ember.evented. So that's not a normal part of what you get when you mix in ember.evented. Views do it because really the whole purpose of a view is to handle events. So it makes it a little bit less syntax in order to do that by just letting you name the methods that way. Oh, so this is the implementation of of what it's doing is its subclass is trigger, which is, if you remember, the method that's called to fire the event on an object. And in addition to calling super, it also looks up a method on this object, and if it exists, it fires that method. So that's just the implementation of how ember.view adds that behavior. So the way that DOM events in Ember work is that there's an event dispatcher component. There's one per application, and it sets up event delegation for lots of common DOM events. There's a whole list. If you look up event dispatcher, you'll see the built-in list, and it's really easy to add your own custom events if there's any that aren't covered. And it uses event delegation, which is, most of you probably know, is way more efficient form of event handling. And it will look at the element that the event is fired from, the target, and it's going to then find the corresponding Ember view, and it's going to then try sending that view to that event to the view. If that view doesn't handle it, it'll bubble up the view hierarchy, parent view to parent view to parent view, until a view does handle it. Event names roughly match their DOM event names. There's one other somewhat esoteric feature, which is that if a view has a property named event manager, that can be an object that Ember will send the events to instead of sending it to the view. I've never actually seen anybody use this in a real app, but in theory, it might be useful to be able to share event handling logic between multiple views. So if anybody does end up using this, tell me, I'm curious. So one more slide, the more you know. I showed all of the examples from the primitives on up. I showed sending one argument, triggering no arguments. You can send arguments along with events when you trigger them, and all of the listeners will receive them. That works with a single argument as well as multiple arguments. And finally, ember.evented.has lets you check to see if there's any listeners for a specific event name. Again, not something you use frequently, but nice to know you're there. Nice to know it's there. So file that under events. We're going to switch gears and look at actions. So if you remember our action example, we had a list item with an action helper, and then we handled that action in the route. So here's basically what happens at a real high level. From the template view layer, an action is fired. It first goes to the controller. If the controller handles it, great. If not, it goes on to the router. The router has a chance to handle it. So this is the way that this works in particular is that the action helper looks for the target. It's actually looking at the target of the view. And when I say the target, it's a property of the view. So it says view, get target, and then send this action to it. If that action is, if that thing is not present, it will say, okay, how about the target of that controller or that object? Send it along. So if you think about this and understand this, there's ways to take advantage of this to change the target of objects to find your own kind of chain of responsibility. So you've got a conventional chain of responsibility that's going from view to controller to route, and you can change that up if you want. And we'll look at how to do that. So actions, whether they're defined in the controller, in the route, or even as you'll see in a view, are defined inside of this actions object. And the reason that we do this is to kind of namespace those actions, so that if you happen to have an action that conflicts with the name of a method that's in the route API, so let's take activate, for example. Let's say you're writing an app for a gym, and activating a membership is kind of this thing that people talk about in your business. It's nice to be able to actually name the object, name the action activate, without having to worry about the fact that there's already a method on route named activate. So that's the purpose of namespacing this. Things can get a little funky in there, and we'll look at, kind of conceptually, we'll look at how we make it easy to work with in a minute. But first, there's options on these action helpers. And this slide shows 4 of them. In the first one, we are specifying a different target for the action. So normally it's going to go to the view's target. Instead, it's going to go to the view itself. So normally the first place an action hits is typically the view's controller, which is by default its target. In this example, I'm saying I want show buttons to go to the view itself directly. The next example uses the on option, and this is showing that we can use not just click, which is the default event that's going to fire this action, but in this case, on mouse enter, engage thrusters. This example is showing multiple arguments to the action. So it's the abort mission is the action name, and this abort reason and health metrics are all arguments that are going to get sent along. And then the last example is showing the allowed keys option, which by default, if you're holding down shift and you click an action helper, nothing will happen. If you want to allow shift, you can say allowed keys equals shift or alt in this example. There's also allowed keys any if you don't care what someone's pressing on the keyboard, you just want to handle the click and have it fire an action. Man, multiple action handlers sure would be handy. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. And it's sort of impossible to make it work right now with the way that handlebars is implemented, but when HTML bars comes around, we should be able to do something along these lines. So we talked a little bit about the router. For controllers, the router by default is injected as the target. There are a few exceptions to this that it's useful to understand because sometimes Ember will set a controller's target to another controller instead of to the router. And the two examples here are when you use the render helper, so that lets you embed a controller template pair inside of another template. It's going to set the rendered controller's target to the template's controller that you're in. So it's kind of its parent, which sort of makes sense. Often you don't even have to worry about this because that chain of responsibility is still going to have it end up at the router. It's just going to go through another parent controller first. So you'll sometimes run into this because you just don't understand why an action handler was being hit. And this can be an explanation. Same thing with when you use the each helper with an item control, and you specify an item controller. Each of those item controllers targets will be set to the parent's controller first, and then it'll then flow to the view. So this is almost always the behavior that you want, but it's useful to understand what's going on. So we talked about this action's object that you nest inside of a route or inside of the controller. One thing that feels weird immediately when you start to see is, well, what if I want to reference my instance? What if I want to reference this route? And fortunately, what Ember does is it makes this inside of this function handler be the route. So it's, by default, you might expect this to be the actions object or something. It's not. It's the route, or it's the controller, or it's the view, which is, again, pretty much always what you want. In addition, if you want to inherit an action handler, let's say that you want to have an announcement that pops up some little toast UI in the right-hand corner of the screen, and that's your default behavior, and then you have an extra annoying route that wants to do that, but also pop up an alert. You can call this._super just like you can most other places in the Ember object model, and it's going to work despite the fact that there's this somewhat odd kind of actions object in the mix. So again, this is the behavior that you usually want, and although it may not seem like it would work intuitively, it does, which is excellent. So the Ember router is a state machine. And state machines are an excellent way to reduce complexity. It lets you kind of isolate your thinking to a particular state of the application and worry about that for now. And when you're ready to worry about another state, you worry about the other state. And in general, in kind of general state machine theory and usage, the way that it works is the external components send events into a state machine. They don't know or care what state the state machine is in. That's the state machine's responsibility. And so you can think about Ember router very similarly. You're sending an action is flowing into the Ember router. The action doesn't know what state the application is in, but the router does. And it's going to take that action and send it to whatever the current route is. So it's a similar win to polymorphism, basic OO theory. You don't necessarily know what you're dealing with, but you know that it's going to handle it appropriate for itself. So let's take a look at how that works.
I don't know how well it's going to carry
Yeah.
people listening online, but your mic is off and away.
Okay, cool. We'll try to keep it up. So our template sends an action to the router. The router then sends the action to the current route. So as an example, I click a logout link in the router, and the router sends the logout action to the current route. And as you can imagine, if I'm looking at a product page on an e-commerce site and the logout action comes, that might be, as an app developer, I might want to handle that very differently than from if I was on the order confirmation page, the last step of the order, and the user clicked the logout link. And so this is an example where it's very easy to have different action handlers in these routes. So the router is not just a state machine, it's a particular kind of state machine called a hierarchical state machine. And what this means is that the states are organized in a hierarchy. And while the router initially sends the action to the current route, if the current route doesn't handle it, that action will then bubble up this route hierarchy, which is super useful. And of course, you know from our router DSL, the router already provides a natural route hierarchy, right? We're already creating a nested structure when we define our routes. So visualizing that, this particular app, we might have over here an application route with an order route nested underneath, and then a few routes nested underneath that resource. So an event comes in, this fires to the current route, doesn't get handled, comes up to the order route, and then flows up eventually to the application route. If you don't handle the action in the application route, by default, Ember will throw an error. If you want to explicitly say, look, I don't care about this action in this state, you can define that action as a ember.k or other kind of no-op. If you want to handle an action but then let it continue to bubble up the hierarchy, you can return true. And a power move that I like to use once in a while is, let's say that you have some complex action that you want to handle in a controller's state manager. You want to have a state manager in a controller. You can say, you can target controller.stateManager from in your action helper and go directly, send the action directly into that state manager. So that's the more you know slide. There's one more you know too. Target action support, similar to ember.evented with events, gives an object the ability to trigger an action with the same semantics that actions are triggered on views. You're going to look for a target, you're going to send along context with it, etc. You can get that behavior yourself by mixing in target action support. And view target action support is perfect for mixing into views if you want to do that at the view layer. And this is really good for programmatically triggering actions. So I showed examples of triggering actions using the action helper. If you want to do something programmatic, you'll want to use this mix-in. On the other side, if you want an object to have the ability to be an action target, to be able to handle actions by having an actions object, like we talked about, you can mix in action handler and make your object behave that way. And in fact, ember.route and ember.controller and ember.view all just mix in ember.action handler. So you'll be using the very same code. So there's a place where this becomes a little bit more interesting and a little bit more nuanced, and that's in ember.components. And as the kind of raison d'etre, and I say that, of components is isolation. And so if something's isolated, you don't want to have semantic binding of name. What is that called? It's a big computer science word. Anybody got it? Connaissance or something like this? Anyway.
What was the question? Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So the type of coupling that happens because things need to be aware of the same name in computer science is, I think, called connaissance or something. Yes, something like that. So If you've got an Ember component that's designed to be shared, you want to avoid that kind of coupling. And so the interesting thing that this makes possible is, let me refresh my memory about what this slide is showing us. Okay, so we've got a component. It's got an action helper inside that fires this toggle body action. You can handle toggle body inside of the component, and it works just the same way that you have views. So sorry, what this particular slide is showing is that the default target for actions in components is the component itself. So views, the default target is the controller. In components, the default is itself, again, for isolation. Where I was going is going to be on the next slide. If you want to emit an action out of a component, for example, you might have a click handler that's going to send an action. All you do is you just say, send action. You don't worry about the name. And then when the person actually uses your component, in this case saying, my button, action equals show user, they're now defining what the name of the action that's going to be emitted is. So then they can define in their controller or route a show user action handler. So it lets us have these component widgets that are super reusable and can be adjusted to really fit into your application's semantics. If you want to support multiple actions coming out of the same component, then you would specify, shown at the bottom here, you specify a mapping. So you call send action with a name, and then your component syntax maps the name to the name that you want to use in the app. So for example, for my video component, you might say, okay, I want play to emit a play video action up into the rest of the application. So again, this is part of the components, the isolation story of components, and is pretty useful. And I just wanted to mention it because it is a little bit different than what we're used to dealing with it in views and such. So that was the fast version of that talk. Thanks for hanging around. Thanks to people on Flickr for the photos. That's me on Twitter, @LukeMelia. Yap Labs, which is one of the sponsors of the meetup, is a company that I have along with Steph and a few other members of Ray, who's here, and Chris Selden. We do Ember consulting in addition, and training in addition to working on Yap. So I'll open up for some questions, and then we can go for drinks. I'll just repeat the question. Jonathan.
There was a slide way back where you had showed action helpers.
Yes.
With the launching the rocket and the what have you.
Yes. I'm going to go there. I'm going to try to go there. Keynote is not cooperating. I am here.
Right. So on the third one, you go abort mission.
Yes.
I've passed this before into the action helper, but the abort reason and health metrics, where do those come from?
Right. So these are bound properties resolved in the context of the template at the time that the event is fired.
Okay. So those are computed properties on the controller. You can send them back.
Exactly. Exactly. Cool. Other questions? Dennis? Good question. The question is, when you're in the router and you are in an action handler and you want to call another action handler, am I right so far? Or in a model hook and you want to call an action handler, how do you do that? I'm going to give you two answers to this question. Number one, don't. Don't do it. Move that functionality to a method on the route, and then delegate to it from your action handler and call it directly from the template. Number two, this.send usually will work if you are actually in that route by that point. Otherwise, it will go to whatever the current route is. So in the model hook, in your particular question, that may not work, and you would need to do the extract method approach that I just described. But if you are in, Okay, Alex.
Going to be that guy. So there's a new thing with, particularly, I think it's in 1.2 beta. So all that stuff that we were talking about with substates and whatever that's been on beta since like Monday. It's kind of a tricky thing when you're asking how do you fire send from within the model hook, because often the model hook gets called on a route that you're not actually in yet. You're trying to enter that route, you're asking the route, what data do I need to get in order to actually transition into that route? But when you say .send, that's going to try to fire it on the like active existing router hierarchy. So whatever, if you try to fire that send event from a route that hasn't been entered yet, it might not go where you're expecting. So 1.2 hasn't actually changed the way that works by just calling route send, but you can call send on the transition object that gets passed into the model hook, and that's always going to fire on all the routes that are like being resolved at that time for the transition you're trying to go into, because we didn't want to mess with the existing API, trying to be as like backwards compatible as possible. And but it's not going to be documented probably for a while since it's still very new. But I think that's probably going to stick around and be the way that you can kind of fire these actions on routes that you're trying to enter into. Make sense?
Cool. There was a question in the back.
Two main arguments that we mentioned action ain't got
A little bit louder.
If too many arguments of action ain't got implemented, what keeps the implement from crashing or looping?
What keeps the implement?
Program from crashing or looping? Doing the same thing over and over again.
Got it. So what keeps an action handler from crashing or becoming an endless loop?
Yeah, if there's too many action handlers.
Yeah. So you could totally do that if you wanted to. I mean, if you wanted to make it loop or crash, you could, and Ember would be like, so just don't do that. There's no built-in protection for it.
Excellent question. It's one of my favorite questions. So the question is, I was a little confused about whether I should implement my action handlers on a controller or on the route. Here's how I think about this. If your action is going to have the effect of changing state into the scope of your controller, then handle the action on the controller. If the action is going to have the effect of changing state, either changing the route, so possibly transitioning to another route, or changing state across multiple controllers or in your model layer, then handle it in the route. In general, handling in the route is somewhat more flexible because you can use the hierarchical properties that I described to kind of handle it in a way that you know is going to be consistent with the state that your application is in, whereas your controller is always the same controller no matter what route your app is in. But in general, I would look at what are the side effects of this action handler, what state is being mutated, and handle it at the level of that mutation. Dominic. When should I use views is the question. So you should use views when you need to do low-level event handling in your view layer. That event handling can include lifecycle events. So if you need to do DOM manipulation yourself, you would use a view and use the did-insert element handler. Hopefully, if you're setting up any event handlers, like jQuery event handlers, DOM event handlers yourself, be paired with the will destroy element handler so that you can clean up after yourself. But in general, you can get away with building a lot of pretty awesome stuff in Ember without implementing views. So if you are going through and you're like, man, I haven't made any views yet, I must be doing something wrong. No, you might not be. You can go a long way with action helpers, as I described. Dominic, again. Sure. Can I give an example of when I've used a view? When I've integrated a jQuery plugin, for example, I've used a view where I implement did insert element and grab the part of the DOM that's just been rendered and then call my jQuery magic on it. That's one example. Another example where I've used a view is when I'm implementing an Ember view that needs to do some pretty low-level stuff. For example, a scroll view that needs to handle crazy touch start, touch end, touch cancel, these kinds of things. Views are essential for that. Other questions? So one would use a view versus a component. So components are really designed for reuse. So if you want to have something that you're reusing in different parts of your application, or especially across applications, I would look closely at a component. If your view needs to be relatively somewhat coupled with your controller, it needs to kind of be aware, and there's a little bit of a dance where you're handing off particular things up to the controller, then you probably want to stick with a view.
Components are also used in the leaves of your application typically. They're not like, you're not going to insert a component in like the middle of your hierarchy. They are very good for abstracting the leaves. You have a D3 graph. You have a file picker. You have something like this. You can compose components for sure, but they don't provide the whole awesome hierarchy that we normally have. And then if you want to insert something higher up, the view is a really good thing to do because the view preserves the hierarchy versus the component is the root of its own hierarchy. It is an isolated thing, whereas the view just plays nicely in its. You should be able to insert a view in the middle of your hierarchy, and it should not affect anything below or above.
Good answer. Anything else before we wrap up for the night? Yes. Why do we hate radio buttons so much? Radio buttons and Ember Select are, I am not ashamed to say it, the embarrassment of Ember. If you grab the reins and help fix this, you will be worshipped as a hero in the community, and I will personally buy you a drink. Cool. So we're gonna, for those of you who are interested, please come out for a drink at Lily's. It's on 17th between Broadway and Union Square, so not too far from here. And we can keep chatting. I'm happy to answer more of these kinds of fun questions or just shoot the shit. See everybody in November.